Good evening and welcome to Thursdays with NAMI. My name is Peg Morrison. I'll be your host tonight. I am the interim director of NAMI North Carolina. That's the National Alliance on Mental Illness, North Carolina. I'm glad you're here. Thursdays with NAMI is our way of building conversations and building community around the topic of mental health. Our guest tonight is Linda Lee, pre-med student at Duke University. Linda's goal is to use her professional skills and personal experiences to support Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. There's so much for young folks to grapple with these days, including mental health conditions, intergenerational trauma, and racial and cultural identity. Linda's well acquainted with the unique impacts of mental health conditions and suicide on the Chinese American community. She personally lost a dear childhood friend to suicide. We'll be talking with her in depth in just another moment. As usual, the first part of our show will be an interview with our guest. Partway through, we'll show a lighthearted video of the week, and then we'll take time to answer your questions, friends on Facebook and members of our studio audience on Zoom. Of course, you're all our friends. That came out a little wrong. Now we're going to have a quick word from our sponsors. Thursdays with NAMI is funded in part by the North Carolina, there we go, Department of Health and Human Services, Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities, and Substance Use Services through the Federal Community Mental Health Block Grant Fund. We're very grateful for them, their guidance, and their support. All righty, now without any further ado, welcome Linda.
Hi, Peg. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here.
Yeah, we always like to start out knowing the background of our guests. What brought you here with us tonight? Tell us about yourself in a nutshell.
Yeah, so a little bit about myself. I am a second generation Chinese American. So my parents immigrated from China back in the 80s. I was born and raised in New Orleans and went to college in Atlanta, and now am at Duke for medical school as a third year medical student. And I'm interested in psychiatry and planning to apply this year for residency. And the reason why I'm here today is, as Peg mentioned earlier, as you mentioned earlier, I lost a friend to suicide back in 2015. And that has really spurred my journey into going into psychiatry and my interest in mental health awareness. And so I've gotten involved in a number of mental health awareness initiatives, one of which is UCA Waves, or United Chinese Americans Waves, which is a youth mental health collaborative that is focused on providing support to Asian American families in particular. And so I'm one of the youth ambassadors there, and thank you so much for dropping a link to UCA in the chat. But yeah, so I'm one of the youth ambassadors there, and I'm really happy to talk about my experience and my journey today.
All right. Well, it sounds like you have a lot to share, and I appreciate your time. I know it's a busy time being a med student and you've recently moved, so I appreciate your generosity of spirit. You've accomplished a lot, Linda. What are you most proud of?
Honestly, I'm not really sure what I'm most proud of. I think there are a lot of things, but one of the things that I'm very proud of is I do a lot at my medical school, and one of the initiatives that I'm involved in is a student organization that's specifically for Asian medical students, or API, identifying medical students. We call this organization a PAMSA. And as president of APAMSA, I have been really involved in community outreach. And so one of the ways that we've been involved is by doing an annual health fair each year, offering basic health screenings. And so this year, the health fair was just a month ago, actually. And I was really trying to advocate for mental health screenings at this event. in particular in order to reach out to the Asian community in the Triangle area, since particularly with AAPI mental health, I think it's something that our community, the AAPI community, doesn't really talk much about. And so offering mental health screenings like at this event are a really great way of sort of breaking the ice and talking about that stigma. So I was really, really proud of myself for being able to incorporate that. And there were definitely there are definitely a lot of barriers and challenges to getting people to go to a mental health screening event, but there are still quite a few who stopped by and were able to get connected to resources in the area, which was really incredible. So I think that's one of the many things I'm proud of.
Good. It is a shame how there is so much stigma and so much hesitation to get help when we need it for a mental health condition. As you were talking, I wonder, does it strike you as a student of medicine, like, wow, this is the one area where people just will not get help?
Yeah, I think definitely mental health or anything psychiatry related is up there in terms of the amount of stigma that's surrounding it. I think there are some other conditions that I think also strike a note. Like I see like um, there's a lot of stigma around like HIV and AIDS, for example, or there's a lot of weight stigma as well against people who are of higher BMIs. And so, but I think mental health stigma in particular is something that people are really afraid to talk about because it gets seen as something that's not normal, that like if you're depressed, there's something wrong with you, right? I think that's something that's a very pervasive stereotype that I think affects all cultures, but particularly I think within many Asian cultures, it's particularly strong.
Mhm. Right. And of course, you alluded to BMI or body mass index. So for folks who are on the bigger side, the heavier side weight wise, there's definitely a stigma there too. Um, so I hope we just continue to grow and evolve and have these conversations that allow people to realize it's okay to ask for help and it's okay to be exactly as we are in this moment, that we're right where we should be. So I appreciate that. And when did you realize you wanted to study psychiatry?
Yeah, I think it was a slow realization actually. Back in college, so my friend had ended his life in my first year of college, and from then I started to become more interested in mental health awareness, but I didn't really consider psychiatry as a particular specialty until um, I was thinking about research opportunities in college, and I was like, I do think that the brain is super fascinating. Why don't I think more about psychiatry as a specialty? Um, and so I got involved in psychiatry research in college, but wasn't quite sure, if that was really what I wanted to pursue until I came to medical school. And then at Duke Medical School, our curriculum is a little bit different, where most medical schools have the preclinical didactic kind of lectures, that curriculum part of it for 2 years, but Duke condenses it all into 1 year. So during that year, I was like, I still don't really know. Psychiatry seems really interesting. Like, I think it's so fascinating to think about the pathophysiology behind all of these different psychiatric conditions. But it wasn't until I did my psychiatry rotation in our second year, which is our clerkship year with all of our rotations. It was when I went into my psychiatry rotation that I was like, okay, this is it. I love talking to my patients on this rotation. I love being around all the other psychiatrists and psychiatry residents here. It seems like it's truly where I fit in. And truly something that I am passionate about and have been passionate about for the last several years. And so that's when I decided, well, this is it for me and there's no turning back now.
it's good news to hear on so many levels. We need passionate people in psychiatry. We need a diverse pool of professionals in the mental health world. Um, we need our mental health doctors and nurses and everyone to look like America. Um, and we need that empathy. So I'm glad that you're finding that path and walking in that direction. And you mentioned having lost a very close friend, childhood friend to suicide. Would you mind telling us about that person and how that impacted you, short term and long term?
Of course. So his name was Luke. Luke was my childhood friend. We had met back in middle school, I believe. Um, and we were really close. We went to high school together. We were in the same Chinese school, which is kind of like extra in addition to regular school. We went to the same church as well, growing up. And then we even dated for a while when we were in high school. And so he was really one of the people, like, I considered myself to be really close to him, definitely. And so when so he was a year older than me, and when I was only maybe a few weeks into my first year of college, I received the news that he had ended his life. And it came as a really big shock to me, because everyone had this perception of him, of Luke, as this great guy. He went to Harvard. He was our salutatorian in high school, and was not he was simply the only reason why he wasn't valedictorian is because he took college, like university classes during high school, and that affected his GPA. So he was like that kind of person, very scholarly, but also the kind of person that everyone loved, and that everyone loved talking to. He was nice, he was kind, he was very talented in all these different kinds of things. And he was the kind of person that all the parents would be like, you should be like him. And so it came as a great shock to everyone, I think, when we all realized that he had passed, and not only because he passed, but because he had ended his life. And for everyone, I think, including me, like, I personally struggled a lot understanding, what was why he ended his life, particularly because I had not known that he was facing depression for the last few years before he had ended his life. Even though we were pretty close, we had never talked about mental health in that way. And he had never brought up the fact of that, like, he was seeing therapy, or that he was taking medication. And so it was really challenging for me to face that realization that someone that I could have known so well ended his life. And that really made me think and yearn more to become involved in mental health awareness, so that I could have a better understanding of how do we tackle those kinds of situations where, someone that we know is facing, suicidal ideation, suicidal thoughts. And what do we do in those kinds of situations? And also, just how do we destigmatize mental illness? Like, how do we tell people, hey, it's okay to talk about your mental health. It's okay to, get support for, if you're having depression, if you're having anxiety. And so that was kind of what led me on that journey in the end to psychiatry, and also to UCA waves and everything that I have been doing. But it was definitely not easy.
Right. Well, what a heartbreaking loss, and I'm so sorry to hear that. Sounds like Luke was very special, and I'm sure that you made a positive difference in his life in some way. Yeah. I lost a friend to suicide as well. Was living in Columbus, Ohio. Um, Gosh, I guess it was 7 or 8 years ago now, and he was in our support group. And I knew that he was struggling, and I could see him struggling over time. So it's always a jolt, but it didn't come out of the blue. And I can't imagine losing someone having had no idea that it was a possibility. That would just that would add, I think, a different level of complication to the grieving and the feeling of loss. But I'm grateful that you're here tonight, and I'm grateful that we have more scenarios where people are giving themselves permission to have conversations about mental health and opening the door, giving ourselves permission and honoring other people when they share those vulnerable feelings and conditions and situations. So, and it's a wonderful thing that I'm sure you'll save young people and open that door for many young people in the future because of the career path you're choosing. Difficult stuff, but we can move forward and with a feeling of hope too. So in your bio, you express a desire to support the Asian American and Pacific Islander communities as they grapple with various issues, mental illness, intergenerational trauma, racial and cultural identity. Help us unpack that a little bit. What does that look like? How will you know if you met that goal?
Yeah, I guess it's a little bit easier to talk about the second question that you had about how I have met that goal because it's really challenging. I don't know if I will will know if I've met that goal. Um, I think it's only really looking at it in individual cases to see if I am making a difference, in terms of like the patients that I see or the friends that I have or the people I talk to when I'm advocating and like the people I meet through advocacy events. I think those are the only ways I can really tell that if I'm having any sort of impact, um, and only in the stories that other people tell me. And so I think the things that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, APIs in particular, face when it comes to mental health stigma is the idea that silence is strength that's a particularly strong cultural stereotype, um, where we're kind of told like bury like your emotions and don't speak out, don't because if you speak out about these kinds of things, then it'll imply that you're weak. Um, and I think that's something that we really have to unpack. Um, how do we even unpack all of this? I think the only way is to just keep telling people and then telling stories of people like Luke and your friend, for example, just all these stories of people who did stay silent or um weren't able to find support, and show them that silence is not the way to show strength in this case. So I think one of the ways that I want to sort of advocate for API communities in that way is definitely talking about that mental health stigma. I think the other ways also that hopefully my goal of becoming a psychiatrist will help a lot with is that, I think APIs also face a lack of resources. Um, you know, Particularly when I'm thinking about some demographics or some populations within API, for many of them, English is their second language, and so they can't communicate well when it comes to mental health. And so they really face that language barrier when they're trying to talk to other providers who can't speak their native language. And so it's really crucial, I think, for there to be more therapists, counselors, psychiatrists, and so many other mental health care providers who can speak those native languages for APIs. And so that's one of my goals. I am like in the process of learning medical Chinese. It's not going very well, but I'm in the process of doing it. And so my goal is to eventually be able to provide that care and also be able to provide care that is culturally sensitive as well. Because I think another challenge that a lot of APIs face as well is that a lot of providers are just not culturally aware. Like all these stereotypes that I'm saying, not everyone knows that. And so I think we have to provide the infrastructure to provide infrastructure that can train our mental health care providers to become more culturally sensitive and culturally competent. But there's a long way, that's a long way coming, I think, at the same time. And so one of the ways that hopefully I'll be able to contribute is just by adding myself to the workforce, hopefully in the future.
That is very powerful. And the language barrier is something I don't always think of immediately. Interesting observation, though, from my experience with NAMI support groups, is that language can be a challenge, even if English is my first language, because so many of us don't grow up with emotional literacy. We don't learn to identify our own feelings. So just being able to formulate the words and frame our thoughts in our first language is challenging, and then add another layer, another barrier. That's a very tall order. So I'm glad that you'll be an extra resource and help and support for folks. I appreciate your comment, Annette, in the chat. A lot of work to be done in terms of stigma around mental health and substance use, and how lessening that stigma can help us combat the suicide rate, which is just downright high, especially for young adults and adolescents who are Black, Indigenous, or persons of color. It's definitely a red flag, the increasing rates of suicide for our young people. Absolutely. So thank you for sharing that. We've got an interesting comment in the Q&A. I usually wait till after our video of the week, but since we're on the topic of your career, I'll pull it in now from Bridget. It's really interesting to me how people get into what they do. I studied psychology in school and have been curious about psychiatry and neuroscience. I've wondered how much psychology is involved in studying psychiatry. And maybe you could point out the difference first to help us all out.
Yeah, definitely. So I think psychology is really the study of the mind. So I think about a lot of theories that people have, like about Freud, for example, is like the person that everyone thinks of immediately. Like I guess I don't know why immediately I thought of more like child development things, but I'm thinking about like Erickson, and there are a lot of others. And so psychology is really thinking about how people think, I guess, is the best way that I can answer that. Psychiatry, though, is still very medicine focused. And that's why psychologists don't go to medical school. Psychologists go to graduate school, they get their PhDs, or I think there are also like PhDs as well, to become a psychologist. But psychiatrists go through medical school. So they go through medical training, and then they learn about these mental health conditions from a very medical standpoint. So we think about it in a more neurologically, what's going on in terms of the pathophysiology. Like, so we're thinking about like neurotransmitters, which are like these basically hormones in your brain, and how that might be affecting your brain, and how that might lead to things like schizophrenia, and or depression or other things like that. And then we learn a lot about medications as well, and how to use those medications. And so that's why psychologists can't prescribe medications, but psychiatrists can. Now, in terms of psychology, or I think another way of thinking about this question is how much therapy, for example, might be involved in psychiatry. And there's actually still a lot of psychology. or a lot of therapy that can be involved in psychiatry, but it's completely up to the psychiatrist to determine how much therapy they want to manage with their patients. So if there's this perception that psychiatrists are, pill pushers. It's not necessarily true. There are some psychiatrists who do only prescribe medications, but then some other psychiatrists also do therapy as well. And so that's a little bit of the difference between the two.
Yeah, thank you. I think that sums it up very clearly. And there are so many different schools of thought with medication. Of course, at NAMI, we support whatever path to recovery works for that individual. Personally, I was a person who I was comfortable doing therapy along my journey as a young person. I thought, well, everyone sees a counselor here and there. That didn't bother me. But as far as medication, I really had a lot of internalized stigma around that. And I didn't want to be one of those sick people. So I did everything I could to avoid medication. I tried St. John's Wort. I did yoga. I joined Toastmasters for public speaking. I jogged. I got a dog. I got married. But what I needed in my case was medication that helped with my depression and my dark thoughts. I know some people have the opposite experience where maybe from a young age they felt pushed into taking medication. I know that's not, I can't imagine that being a helpful road, and I'm sorry that that happens to some folks. But the important takeaway is that it's a unique path that we all travel, and it's going to be different for different folks. So thanks everyone for your comments in the chat box and on Facebook. All righty, what's next in my magic list of questions? What do you wish people knew about Asian Americans and mental health?
Yeah, I think kind of already talked a little bit about one of the cultural stereotypes that we have about silence is strength. But I think another really important thing to realize is that although there are a lot of statistics that go around about mental health and then looking at racial or demographic breakdown. And although I believe the statistic is that although Asian Americans or AAPIs have, similar rates of mental illness as other races, I think as whites, I believe that Asian Americans, however, are less likely to seek services. I believe the race or the race that is most or least likely to seek mental health services. And that's just really I think that speaks a lot to the stigma that is so deeply ingrained within our culture. And I think it's also what is even more interesting is that something that I believe Lily posted in the chat earlier is also that there are only 3% of psychologists or therapists who identify as API. That is the percentage is a little bit better for psychiatrists, but also still relatively low. And so the fact of the matter is that, we have so many APIs who have mental illness, but they're not seeking resources or services for their mental illness. And the reason is possibly because of the mental health stigma that they face, but also possibly because there just aren't enough resources that are going around to support them. Like if there are not enough therapists who look like them, who look like these patients, these people, then, it would be so much more difficult for them to access those resources. And so that's what I really want to instill in other people, that we're a group that very much is in need of more assistance in this area.
Yeah, hearing you chat, I didn't realize that the silence is strength theme was a big piece of Asian American culture. I grew up in a traditional Irish American family, and it was very similar in that regard, that stiff upper lip, and you want to be stoic and strong, not show emotion. So I relate to that part a lot. Um, yeah, it is a tough thing. I also agree, as a white person, that comes with some privilege, some things that I don't have to worry about. I want to acknowledge that, and picking a therapist who's white, very easy thing to do. I heard a speaker once talking about how, imagine being an older man of color. He was African American, an older Black man, and going in to talk about your medication and your sexual side effects. And the person who greets you is a 20-something, blonde-haired, blue-eyed clinician. And how does that feel? And that opened my eyes a lot, just hearing it put that way. Absolutely. So thank you for addressing that and touching on that. It's so important. You have a passion for storytelling and art, kind of a Renaissance woman, I think. Tell us about the intersection of creativity and recovery from a mental health condition.
Yeah. Um, I personally have had a depressive episode here and there as well. And have, even when I cannot say that I'm clinically depressed, there are definitely downs, lows in my life. And so I personally have been very cognizant of when I'm in that kind of state of mind. I really try to let it out in some sort of outlet, and that oftentimes is through various forms of art. So I was a creative writing major in college, and so one of the things that I really like doing is just writing, and reflective writing is really something that I do a lot. But I tend to also write short stories, fictional short stories or nonfiction short stories. Sometimes it's nice to write things that are not about myself, but in a way are still about myself as well, in order to process those emotions that I'm going through. And so I think that, I think writing is definitely a beautiful way for me to process and reflect on, difficult times in my life in particular, as well as art. I really enjoy a lot of sketching, drawing, painting, calligraphy, all of these things, and they're all really things that I like to engage in. I think though there is this perception that, I guess, like, I don't know why your question made me think of this, but I think there is a perception that, a lot of people with mental illness are creatively inclined, which is not necessarily true. I definitely know some people who are not creatively inclined in the sense of like art, or in the ways that we'll traditionally say that creativity is shown. But I do think that, yeah, that for me at least, that working with my mental illness, thinking about my emotions, has definitely informed my writing and my art as well.
Hmm. I can be a creative person as well. I used to play guitar and sing for a long time, and I've always liked to write too. And I think I like that combination of expression and getting something off my chest, but also making structure out of chaos. That combination is very, very satisfying.
Mhm.
Okay. So, well, thank you. Kent wrote in the box, Peg is creative. I appreciate that, Kent. I'm sure you are too. This was intriguing in your bio. You taught elementary and junior high students in Taiwan from 2019 to 2020. What did you learn from the culture and from teaching children?
Yeah. So my parents are from China, and although I would say Taiwanese culture is not the same as Chinese culture. I think there are a lot of similarities because a lot of people from Taiwan came to China within the last century. Um, and so, or I think I said that wrong. People from China came to Taiwan within the last century. Apologies. But yeah, so I think there are a lot of parts of Taiwanese culture that I was familiar with, but what I really enjoyed was still being able to see more of the nuances, and seeing how that also informed my own heritage and the ways that my parents speak to me as well. Uh, I think Taiwanese people are so kind and welcoming. And I think there's a very common theme within Asian cultures, or perhaps maybe Pan-Asian overall, culture in general, about community and how important community is, as well as family. And I think that really made an impact on me, and understanding how, as a teacher, I think for my students, I had a much deeper relationship than I ever had as a student with my teachers growing up in the US. Because I think the kids in Taiwan looked at me as not necessarily as a mom or like a maternal figure, because I was too young for that, but more as like really a very, very close older sister. They would come to me all the time, play
Aw.
games with me, chat with me, like write me little letters and draw me art and things like that. And so it was really absolutely precious. And honestly, one of the best times of my life. And so I think I learned a lot. I learned a lot in that sense, just understanding how relationships can transcend language barriers and cultural barriers as well. And I'm still even friends with my my students on Facebook every now and then. I'll still talk to them. And so yeah, I think that it was a really amazing experience.
Well, that's lovely. That sounds amazing. Um, and it is children just have a way of touching our hearts, don't they? Very adorable. All right. What does self-care look like for you today? It must be tough with the challenging of a medical student and soon to be professional.
Yeah, I think that a lot of people have a perception of self-care as like very specific things like yoga or running or um meditation, which all of which I do not really do. I'm not very physically active, which is really not a good thing as someone who is in medical school and realize the importance of physical activity. But definitely, like I said before, the writing and the art are ways that I care for myself. I really love reading. You can't tell, but these are all books over here. And but I think really what helps me a lot is just being able to chat with my friends and family. I think that's my own way of caring for myself, is by being able to be in community with others. Whether that's my friends, my family, my church that I'm a part of. I think that being around others is in a way caring for myself as well.
Mhm. Yeah, that's a really interesting way of putting it, that we do kind of compartmentalize. Self-care is over here. It's this kind of behavior.
Mhm.
Through NAMI, honestly, and through therapy, through a lot of different things, I've learned that self-care is kind of a constant. Mindfulness is such a buzzword these days, but a constant awareness, a constant paying attention to my self-talk and realizing that I can steer myself in a better direction. It takes awareness, and it takes the desire to slow down and make that change. It feels a little bit clunky, especially early on in the process, but self-care is also just the way we train ourselves over time. Yeah. Okay. One more question before we wrap up our interview portion. What gives you hope?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of things. In terms of like what we've been talking about with mental health or mental uh illness stigma within the AAPI community, I think it's just hearing the stories that aren't what I don't like calling them successes because that's not what it's necessarily about. It's not like things are wins or losses, but just hearing the good that is coming. So for example, I have a family member who has pretty severe depression. And she has really had a hard time over the last few years. And despite my several conversations with her, being able to like try to convince her to go to therapy or to seek treatment or counseling in some way, to seek some sort of help in some way, she's been really adamant against it. But recently she's been actually very interested in it. And I think part of that is because her friend was talking about seeing therapy. And it was just because her friend had just so casually mentioned it that it was just like, it was an everyday occurrence, that it was no big deal. I think that my family member was finally like, oh, wow, like, it's not that hard to go see a therapist. And so things like that, the fact that, it's becoming almost everyday language, that going to therapy is completely normal for or is becoming more normalized. I think things like that, as well as seeing people like my family member starting to seek counseling, seeking services, that's really encouraging to me and gives me a lot of hope for the future.
That does. It is a wonderful thing when people can sort of come along and evolve and realize, that's a thing. It reminds me of my own mother, who passed from Alzheimer's, but she lived with depression and anxiety for many years and didn't talk about it, just did her best to muddle through. And when she did try to get help, it was in the early 70s, they gave her Valium and she had 6 kids. So that really wasn't going to work for her. But fast forward to my adult years, and I got a bunch of people together for a baseball game. And my friend Richard was from the supportive housing agency where I worked. He was a huge baseball buff, and he lived with schizophrenia. He was just very open with his story. And he said to my mom, well, yeah, Mary, I live with schizophrenia. I was homeless for a number of years, and this is how I got my life on track. And I was like, oh my gosh, how's my mom going to react to this? And she floored me. She said, well, Richard, I do understand a little bit. I've had depression my whole life. I had postpartum depression. And I'd never heard those words come out of her mouth prior to that day. But sometimes a new face, a new environment giving you permission, it makes a world of difference. Yeah, so even us from Stoic cultures can learn to speak that language of recovery and hope.
Yeah. Yeah, those kinds of stories are so incredible.
Yeah, eye-opening. Well, it's been a pleasure so far. We're going to wrap up the interview portion of our show, Linda. Before we move to our video of the week, a big shout out to our volunteer working behind the scenes, Bridget Williamson. She's been super helpful around the office, and she's with us for the first time on Thursdays with NAMI. And of course, big shout out to Linda again for spending your evening with us. I appreciate it so much. We're going to show a fun video of the week. This is Roxy Morrison, one of our NAMI North Carolina mascots from the past. Aw, I never get sick of that one. All right. Thanks for your chat comments. So cute and bow wow. All right. Big fans of Roxy out there. All right. So we've got lots of comments about medication and concerns about giving medication too quickly before you understand people in their situation. I appreciate your expressing that concern. Do you have a response, Linda?
Yeah, I think, I can't speak on behalf of all psychiatrists, and I'm not even one yet. So, but I think that for me personally, I believe that medication is not always the answer, right? I think that this was something you were mentioning before, Peg, as well, that, you have to look at each individual and see, what would work for them. And for some individuals, maybe medication is not the answer. And, if particularly if patients that I'm speaking to are not interested in medication, I obviously will not force that upon them. Um, and so I think it's really crucial for me as a future psychiatrist, as well as anyone who's considering psychiatry as a future field, to think about the importance of, thinking about therapy or other treatments instead, thinking about other strategies. And so, yeah, I definitely appreciate your comments, Todd, and uh, you go too as well, Todd.
So what are your thoughts about new medications? And I do hear people concerned, came up an awful lot with the COVID vaccine because it was an expedited approval process from the Food and Drug Administration. But there is a feeling with psychotropic or mental health medications that we're experimenting to some extent. What are your thoughts about new medications?
Well, once again, it's a little bit more challenging for me to speak on them since I'm only a student, and not currently practicing. But I think that I think as once again, also is highly individual depending on case by case, right? You know, I think it's totally possible to consider a new medication if a patient has tried so many others and none of them worked, like in that case, why not try the new medication? As long as the individual themselves is also interested and open to the idea of it. But I would also say, a lot of the psychotropic medications that we already have, our older ones as it may, are already so effective. And so I think there's definitely like we can definitely continue to use them as well and rely on what we already know. So I personally, when I'm practicing, I'll definitely be relying more on what I already know, but also I wouldn't be completely closed, or I would definitely still be open to using new medications in patients who are interested, and maybe that might be the best option for them. Always just looking at what is their best option.
I like that answer a lot. I remember when I started taking medication, I had a friend who was really against it. And she said,
Mhm.
I was taking Prozac. That was the first thing I was prescribed. And she said, there are studies on Prozac that they increase social conformity. And, she was challenging me. She was a direct person. And I paused and I thought about it. And I said, I don't care. I've been miserable for a very long time. And if that's a result of me feeling better, I want to feel better. So it really does depend on the person, where they are in their journey. Sometimes you feel very ready to take that risk. So I like this question. Have you completed a third-year research project at Duke? If yes, what was it about? Go Duke.
Yeah, I'm not sure who asked this, but whoever it was probably familiar with Duke's medical school curriculum, which is that in our third year, which is the year that I'm currently in, we do a research project. And so that's what they're referring to, the third year research project. And so my third year research project is a qualitative study looking at provider stigma, not for mental health specifically, or I guess a little bit, but I'm looking at provider stigma against patients who have higher BMIs. So looking at weight stigma in that sense, but also looking at provider stigma against patients with eating disorders. And so it's really interesting to see, based off the interviews that I've done with both patients as well as providers, to see kind of all these different thoughts that are surrounding weight and body image and eating, which I think is particularly relevant in our society with diet culture and everything that we hear about that, as well as, all these different sort of thought processes or movements that have arisen and result, like body positivity, body neutrality, health at every size, etc.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any insights that you can share, or is it way too early?
It might be a little too early. I'm in the process of closing up my interviews and have to do my analysis, so I can't quite say anything. But I will say that one of the things that comes up pretty often is the perception that particularly anorexia is only for patients or people who are of low BMI. So in the past, historically, within medicine, there used to be criteria for anorexia that patient had to have a BMI of less than 18.5, I believe it was. But what we've found is that that's completely not true. That there are people who are either normal weight or overweight with higher BMIs, who still have anorexia, who are still not eating well. And just because of their weight, they in the past didn't qualify, were not officially diagnosed with anorexia, but it's definitely a thing. And so that, I think that's one of the many things that have come up very, very commonly with the discussions that I've had.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we seem to always want people to look the part, something about the human brain. We want to label people. All right, that sounds fascinating. We'll look forward to hearing the full reports. And comment from Todd on the idea of labeling people and how labels tend to follow folks. And this kind of got me thinking, from having met a lot of folks with different diagnoses, people really struggle with the schizophrenia and schizoaffective disorder diagnoses. Like it just seems to hit home in such a personal way, and they feel very othered by that. I even met a gentleman who he was a clinician, and he had his own definition of psychosis that involved it looked at social reactions and stigma as part of what would make psychosis outcomes better or worse, which makes perfect sense. You can recover from psychosis. Stigma and shaming are harder, if depending on a lot of variables. What are your thoughts on labeling people? And I mean, how do you get rid of that situation with stigma?
Yeah. I think labels are really hard, of course. In particular, I in general don't like to use labels as much. So like when I'm thinking about that, I guess to sort of define that, like you're using schizophrenia as an example. I think a lot of people, um, I think some patients of mine who have schizophrenia, I think some people will call them like schizophrenics, and then they'll, with that term comes all these other associations and stereotypes that come with it, that they're quote unquote crazy, and that they're psychotic, and that they're homeless, they're always hallucinating, they don't know, that they're dangerous. That's another huge stereotype that comes with them. And I think that that kind of labeling is very dangerous. I don't, because of all the stereotypes that come with it, because I know a lot of patients with schizophrenia who are not dangerous. They're, very pleasant, and honestly, some of the best, like my favorite people to talk to at times. And so I think it's definitely really challenging to use labels. But at the same time, I think that other people, have a very strong affinity to the labels at times. So I'm thinking like, I so we talked a little bit about weight stigma because of my research. But the whole idea of the fat positive movement now, that a lot of people are, sort of embracing that label that they used in the past, that used to be associated, or to some extent is still associated with a lot of negative stereotypes. But a lot of people also really embrace that as well. And so I think really when it comes to thinking about labels, what's really important is asking the other person, what do you like to be called? How do you want to be identified as? And making it about that individual case. I think it's so easy for us to see other people and associate and put these labels on others, but thinking about, about what does each person prefer is really, I think, the way to be most cognizant and sensitive to other people as well.
Mm-hmm. Can't go wrong with that, asking people what they're comfortable with and allowing them to make the label or the definition. Wonderful comments in the chat from Jane. I agree, the brain is just another organ. And educating people about mental illness. You are not your illness. Thanks to Annette for that comment. And from Todd, thank you so much for sharing your valuable time with us tonight, Linda. So thank you for being such a polite and constructive audience. This is very lovely to read your comments. We have a lull in the questions, so I'll read some quick announcements. Please fill out our Zoom survey at the end of the show. It lets us know what went well and how we might improve over time with the show. It also allows us to show our funders, yes, we did evaluations and you're getting good value for your grant dollars. Please join us next week. My friend Scott Sadalino will be here. He's a character. I might or may not get a word in edgewise. He's going to talk about his life with depression, substance use, and working on various political campaigns. He's an interesting systems thinker. Join us and you won't want to miss that. We have our walk coming up on May 20th, the NAMI North Carolina Walk at Perimeter Park in Morrisville. So it's close to Durham. It's close to just about everywhere. You can support us in many different ways. You can be a volunteer, you can walk, you can contribute, you can send out positive energy into the universe or pray or whatever you do to support folks. So we would love to see you, hear from you, and anything like that. Ken, I see you're pointing us to the chat and I'm not sure I'm seeing a question there. I don't want to miss it. I understand that many new medications are created after earlier meds and then go generic. I'm not sure. I guess Kent was directing us to that. Any thoughts on generic drugs?
I'm for them. I don't know what else to say beyond that. If they're cheaper and they're still effective or the same amount of efficacy, then why not?
Right on. That definitely works for me. Okay, well, it seems like we are at the end of our time together. We kind of go with the flow and the energy of the group and answer questions as long as they're here. Thanks everyone for being here tonight. Linda, do you have any closing arguments?
I don't know about closing arguments, but definitely it was a pleasure to talk to you, Peg, as well as talk to all the people who were posting questions in the chat. So it was so lovely to be here.
Thank you so much. I absolutely enjoyed meeting you and our conversation, and I wish you the very best. If you're out there, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh no, I just said thank you.
If you're out there feeling alone, please call us at the NAMI helpline. We definitely understand what it's like to be on the outside, and we'd like to bring you into our circle, talk about what we do, our free classes and support groups, or point you in the right direction for professional care. Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful week. Good night.